The morning sun had just begun to shine through the tall glass windows of the city courthouse. The hallways were busy, full of people moving quickly, whispering and waiting for their turn. It looked like any other day, but something about the air felt different. Tense, heavy, as if something big was about to happen. Inside courtroom 3B, the judge's seat was already prepared, the flags behind it standing tall and still. The sound of footsteps echoed as lawyers flipped through their papers, and the clerk arranged the files on the desk. Everyone was waiting for the session to begin. Detective Mark Stevens entered the room with a slow, confident walk. He wore his badge proudly on his chest, his uniform neatly pressed, and a faint smirk sat on his face. Mark was known for being smart, but also for his arrogance. He had solved several high-profile cases and thought of himself as someone above the rules. Many of his co-workers respected him, but others quietly disliked how he treated people he believed were less important. Today, he was not here as a hero but as a witness in a misconduct hearing, something that slightly bruised his ego. When he took his seat, his sharp eyes scanned the room. Reporters sat at the back, a few spectators whispered softly, and on the bench sat Judge Harold Bryant, a calm, dark-skinned man in his early 50s with a reputation for fairness and intelligence. Judge Bryant had seen all kinds of people in his courtroom, from powerful politicians to petty thieves. He never raised his voice unless absolutely necessary. His presence carried quiet authority. But to Mark, the sight of a black judge presiding over him sparked something unpleasant inside, a mix of superiority and disbelief. He didn't say it out loud, but his attitude showed it clearly. The bailiff called everyone to rise as Judge Bryant entered. The courtroom fell silent instantly. The judge nodded politely and took his seat, then said, "You may be seated." His voice was calm and even, the kind that made people listen without fear but with respect. Mark crossed his arms and leaned back slightly, his smirk returning. To him, this was just another formality, a boring morning he wanted to get through quickly. The proceedings began. The prosecutor read out the summary of the case, explaining that the detective was there to give testimony about an incident involving a fellow officer. While everyone else listened seriously, Mark seemed distracted. He tapped his pen on the table, checked his watch, and occasionally looked around the courtroom with a hint of impatience. A few people noticed his behavior, exchanging uneasy glances, but no one dared say anything. Judge Bryant, however, noticed everything. His years of experience had trained him to read people, every flicker of emotion, every careless gesture. He didn't react immediately. Instead, he continued to listen attentively. After a few minutes, he asked Mark to come to the witness stand. Mark stood up slowly, his body language relaxed, almost casual, as if this was beneath him. He adjusted his tie and walked to the front. As soon as he began speaking, his tone carried arrogance. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, but the way he said it was anything but respectful. His answers were short, sometimes sarcastic. He looked directly at the judge as if challenging him. When asked a question he didn't like, he would sigh loudly or roll his eyes. The people in the courtroom began to sense the growing tension. It wasn't common for anyone, especially a police officer, to act this way toward a judge. Some of the younger officers sitting at the back shifted uncomfortably. Even the lawyers kept glancing between the detective and the judge, waiting to see how long this would go on. Through it all, Judge Bryant remained calm. He didn't interrupt or show anger. He simply continued with the hearing, his tone polite and professional. Every now and then he would look at Mark with eyes that seemed to say, "Be careful with your words." But Mark didn't take the hint. He believed his position as a detective gave him an invisible shield, that no one, not even a judge, would dare to challenge him. Outside the courthouse, the city carried on as usual, cars honking, people hurrying to work, life moving forward. But inside that courtroom, the atmosphere grew heavier by the minute. What started as a routine hearing was turning into something much more personal, something charged with ego and pride. Mark's arrogance blinded him from noticing the quiet strength of the man in front of him. Judge Bryant wasn't the kind of person who needed to raise his voice to command respect. His calmness itself was power. He had faced discrimination and disrespect many times in his career, but he had always believed that the best response to arrogance was dignity. As the session continued, It became clear that this was not just about one detective giving testimony. It was about character. It was about respect, something Mark seemed to have forgotten. The murmurs in the courtroom grew quieter, replaced by an uneasy silence. Everyone could feel that this clash of pride and patience would soon lead to something unexpected. By the time the judge asked the final question of the morning, the air felt electric. Mark gave another careless reply, and the judge paused for a long moment before speaking. His expression was unreadable, his voice calm as ever. No one could tell what he was thinking. But one thing was certain: this was not over. That morning, what had begun as a routine court session was slowly turning into a moment that would be remembered by everyone who witnessed it. Detective Mark Stevens had no idea that before the day ended, his pride would be tested in a way he never imagined. And Judge Harold Bryant, with his quiet strength, was about to teach him a lesson he would never forget. The courtroom had settled into a heavy silence after the morning session, yet something uneasy still hung in the air. When Detective Mark Stevens returned to the stand, his expression was sharper, his confidence stronger, and his pride even heavier than before. He had convinced himself that the quiet judge sitting across from him wouldn't dare challenge him. In his mind, Judge Harold Bryant was just another man in a black robe, not someone to be taken seriously. As the questioning continued, Mark's attitude began to shift from careless to openly mocking. He answered questions with smirks and half shrugs. When the judge asked for clarification on a certain report, Mark chuckled softly and said, "I thought that was obvious, Your Honor. Maybe I should explain it slower." The room froze for a moment. The words weren't loud, but the tone, sharp, dripping with disrespect, cut through everyone. The court clerk dropped her pen. Even the prosecutor's eyes widened slightly. Judge Bryant looked at the detective for a long second. His expression did not change. His voice remained calm and steady as he said, "Detective Stevens, please confine your answers to the questions asked." The judge's politeness only seemed to irritate Mark more. He nodded dramatically and replied, "Of course, Your Honor," drawing out the words as if mocking the judge's calmness. A few soft gasps echoed around the courtroom, but the judge continued, unshaken. Every time the judge spoke, Mark seemed to look for new ways to push his limits. When asked about a police report, he laughed lightly and said, "Maybe if the court had better investigators, this wouldn't be so confusing." His arrogance filled the room like smoke, slow, thick, and suffocating. No one dared to move or speak. People could feel something building, something dangerous but unseen. Judge Bryant leaned slightly forward. "Detective Stevens," he said in a firm voice, "this courtroom is not a place for sarcasm. You are expected to show respect to these proceedings." Mark gave a tight smile. "Of course, Your Honor," he replied again, his words coated with irony. The confidence in his tone was the kind that comes from years of getting away with everything. A man too sure that his badge made him untouchable. The judge glanced briefly at the spectators. Their eyes were fixed on the front of the room. Everyone sensed a silent storm coming. Some whispered quietly, unable to believe what they were witnessing. It wasn't common to see a detective mock a judge so openly. The cross-examination continued, and with every answer, Mark's tone grew bolder. When asked about his report inconsistencies, he shrugged and said, "If the court can't understand a simple statement, I don't think that's my problem." His voice carried across the room, clear and arrogant. The prosecutor's face tightened, but before he could speak, the judge raised his hand slightly. A simple gesture that brought the entire room back to silence. Judge Bryant looked directly into Mark's eyes. His voice was low, calm, but with a quiet strength that made the room colder. "Detective Stevens," he said, "I would advise you to choose your words carefully." For a brief moment, Mark's smirk faded, but pride quickly pushed it back. He leaned on the witness stand and said, "No offense, Your Honor, but I've been doing this a long time. I know how these things go." The judge didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his attention to his notes, flipping a page slowly. The sound of paper turning was the only thing breaking the silence. Everyone watched, holding their breath, sensing that something important was about to happen. Minutes passed like hours. The session resumed, but Mark's behavior didn't improve. Every time the judge tried to guide the discussion, Mark interrupted, making sarcastic remarks that made the courtroom tremble with tension. It was no longer a legal hearing. It had become a battle of pride. Finally, Judge Bryant set his pen down, his movements calm and deliberate. He looked up at the detective, his expression unreadable. The courtroom fell utterly silent. The judge said softly, "Detective, this is your final warning. This court will be respected." Mark laughed under his breath, shaking his head as if the situation amused him. "Understood, Your Honor," he said, mocking the tone of respect. The moment was electric. Everyone knew that the detective had crossed an invisible line, one that could not be uncrossed. Even those who admired him looked down now, ashamed. As the session ended, people left the courtroom whispering about what they had just seen. "He's going too far," one lawyer muttered. "The judge won't let that slide," another whispered back. But Mark walked out proud, shoulders straight, still wearing that same careless smirk. He didn't notice how the judge's eyes had followed him as he left, not in anger, but in quiet calculation. The morning had started with arrogance. The afternoon would bring consequences. And before the day ended, Detective Mark Stevens would learn a painful truth: that silence in a courtroom isn't weakness. Sometimes, silence is the sound of justice preparing to speak. The courtroom was quieter than ever that afternoon. The air felt thick, almost heavy, as if every person inside could sense that something was about to happen. Detective Mark Stevens sat at the witness stand once again, confident as always, though the faintest hint of irritation showed in his eyes. He believed the morning's events were behind him, that the judge would simply move on. But Judge Harold Bryant hadn't forgotten the detective's mocking tone or his arrogance. He remembered every smirk, every sarcastic remark, and yet his face showed nothing but calm. When the court resumed, Judge Bryant began to question the detective again. His voice was soft but steady, his words clear and deliberate. "Detective Stevens," he said, "earlier this morning, you stated that the evidence was handled properly. Are you certain there were no mistakes in your report?" Mark gave a small, confident laugh. "I'm sure, Your Honor, I've been doing this long enough to know what I'm doing." His tone was polite, but the pride behind it was sharp. The judge simply nodded, writing something on a piece of paper. That simple act, calm, silent, and unbothered, made Mark feel strangely uneasy. For the first time, he noticed how still the judge was. His movements were measured, his voice steady, his expression unreadable. There was no anger, no visible reaction to Mark's disrespect, only silence. But it wasn't an empty silence. It was a silence that carried authority, one that warned without speaking. The people in the courtroom could feel it too. Every word the judge spoke was calm, but it had weight. It felt like a father quietly reminding his child to behave, not by shouting, but with controlled strength. The more composed Judge Bryant remained, the more restless Mark became. As the questioning continued, the detective's tone began to shift. His answers grew shorter, his voice tighter. Deep down, he started to feel something unfamiliar: discomfort. For years, he had walked into courtrooms with total confidence, certain that his badge and experience gave him power. But in front of Judge Bryant, his pride wasn't working. The judge's calm eyes seemed to see right through him. At one point, the judge paused the proceedings for a brief moment. He looked up from his papers and said quietly, "Detective Stevens, I remind you again, this courtroom is a place of order. You are expected to answer respectfully." There was no anger in his tone, no threat, and just quiet firmness. The words hit harder than any shout could. A few people in the back nodded subtly, impressed by the judge's patience. Mark forced a smile and replied, "Of course, Your Honor." But his voice cracked slightly, betraying the confidence he was trying to hold on to. The minutes passed slowly. Every question from the judge felt more pointed now, not cruel, but precise, like each one was gently exposing the cracks in Mark's attitude. The detective's arrogance began to fade into defensiveness. His eyes darted around the courtroom, avoiding the judge's gaze. At one moment, when the judge asked for clarification, Mark leaned forward and said, "With all due respect, sir, I already explained that." His tone was irritated, almost childish. Judge Bryant looked at him calmly. "Then explain it again, detective," he said. "The court must be sure." The way he said it, calm, unwavering, with just the slightest emphasis on must, silenced Mark instantly. There was no argument left to make. The judge's authority filled the room like quiet thunder. Even those sitting in the back seats straightened their posture, sensing they were witnessing something powerful. A man who didn't need volume to command respect. As the session went on, Mark started to realize that the judge wasn't ignoring his arrogance. He was controlling it. Every time Mark tried to provoke him, the judge responded with grace. Every disrespectful remark was met with calm instruction. And the more the judge stayed composed, the smaller Mark began to feel. The detective's pride was cracking. He tapped his fingers on the stand nervously, his earlier smirk long gone. He tried to avoid meeting the judge's eyes, but it was impossible. Those steady, wise eyes made him feel as though every part of his arrogance was being silently examined. By the end of the questioning, Mark's confidence had dimmed. His replies were still defensive, but quieter. The judge gave him one final look before calling for a short recess. He didn't scold him, didn't lecture him, bro, but the unspoken message was clear. You are being watched. Be careful. When the courtroom emptied, people began whispering softly. One lawyer leaned to another and said, "Did you see how the judge handled him?" Without even raising his voice. The other replied, "That's real authority. He doesn't need to shout to make a point." Outside, Mark walked out quickly, avoiding everyone's eyes. He tried to convince himself that he wasn't bothered, that he was still in control. But deep down he felt a strange discomfort, a small voice whispering that he had gone too far. And as he stepped out into the cold afternoon air, he couldn't shake off the feeling that something about this day was different. The judge's silence wasn't weakness, and it was a warning, one that Mark hadn't fully understood yet. But soon he would. The quiet before the storm had begun. The next morning, the courtroom was full again. The wooden benches creaked softly as people settled into their seats. Word had already spread about the tense exchange between Detective Mark Stevens and Judge Harold Bryant the day before. Some people came out of curiosity, others because they sensed something was about to happen. Even the lawyers whispered among themselves, their eyes occasionally glancing toward the door, waiting for the detective to enter. When Mark finally walked in, his boots echoed across the polished floor. He looked the same as always, confident, perfectly dressed, and carrying the same self-assured expression. But deep inside, he was still bothered by the judge's calm silence from yesterday. He couldn't explain why it haunted him. Something about that stillness, that quiet power, had made him uneasy all night. Judge Bryant entered shortly after, his robe flowing behind him as he took his seat. The bailiff called the court to order, and the hearing resumed. The atmosphere was heavier now, as if everyone was holding their breath. Mark was called back to the witness stand. The judge's voice was firm but polite as he said, "Detective Stevens, please continue from where we left off." Mark adjusted his tie and gave a small nod, pretending to be composed. But his pride wouldn't let him forget yesterday's warning. He felt the need to show that he wasn't intimidated. He wanted to win back the attention, to prove that he was still the powerful one in the room. As the questioning began, the tension between the two men grew more visible. Each word Mark spoke carried an edge. Each question the judge asked was measured and calm. It was a quiet duel, pride against patience, arrogance against dignity. When the judge asked about a missing detail in the report, Mark leaned forward slightly and said, "Maybe if the court reviewed the evidence more carefully, we wouldn't be repeating things." The courtroom froze. The words weren't loud, but they carried the sting of open disrespect. A few gasps rippled through the audience. The clerk dropped her pen. The prosecutor looked up sharply. Judge Bryant didn't react. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting gently on the desk. His eyes met Mark's, calm but piercing. The silence that followed was unbearable. Mark shifted in his seat, realizing too late how far his words had gone. Then, in a voice that was calm but carried the weight of thunder, the judge said, "Detective Stevens, do you understand that you are under oath?" Mark blinked. "Of course, Your Honor." "Then remember," the judge continued softly, "that truth and respect walk together in this courtroom. Without one, the other cannot stand." The detective swallowed hard. His arrogance flickered for a brief moment, but his ego still fought to hold control. "I understand, Your Honor," he replied, though the edge in his voice hadn't fully disappeared. The judge gave him a long look, steady, unblinking. "Do you?" he asked quietly. That simple question made the room feel colder. Even those who had seen hundreds of trials felt something shift. Mark hesitated before answering. "Yes," he said finally, though the confidence behind the word was gone. The judge nodded slowly. "Then proceed carefully." The session continued, but the detective's attitude didn't improve for long. His pride, wounded by the subtle power of the judge's calmness, began to flare again. When the prosecutor cross-examined him, Mark grew defensive and irritated. His voice grew sharper, his tone impatient. At one point, the judge asked, "Detective, please keep your tone appropriate for this court." Mark laughed under his breath and muttered, "I didn't realize tone was part of justice now." The courtroom went completely silent. Even the ticking of the wall clock seemed to stop. Everyone's eyes turned to the judge, waiting. Judge Bryant didn't move right away. His silence was so strong that it made Mark's mockery echo louder in everyone's mind. Finally, the judge spoke, his tone low and steady. "Detective Stevens, are you finished?" Mark leaned back, arms crossed. "Yes, Your Honor," he said with forced confidence. The judge nodded once. Then he turned to the bailiff and said very clearly, "Officer, place Detective Stevens under arrest for contempt of court." The words struck the room like lightning. A wave of shock swept through the audience. Mark froze, his smirk vanishing instantly. "What?" he said, disbelief coloring his voice. "Contempt of court," the judge repeated. "You have disrespected this institution repeatedly despite clear warnings. The law does not bow to arrogance." The bailiff hesitated, glancing between them, unsure if he heard correctly, but the judge's steady eyes left no doubt. "Carry out the order," he said calmly. Slowly, the bailiff stepped forward, his hand resting on Mark's shoulder. The detective's face went pale. The courtroom was so silent that even the sound of the handcuffs clicking around his wrists felt deafening. The proud detective who once believed no one could touch him now stood powerless. His head bowed, his pride shattered. Judge Bryant watched silently, his expression firm but not cruel. "Respect," he said quietly, "is not given by force. It is earned by humility." For a moment, no one in the room breathed. Then the reality settled in. Justice had just spoken in a way none of them would ever forget. And in that silent courtroom, the man who once believed he was above everyone finally learned that no one, no matter their rank, stands higher than the law. The sound of the judge's command still hung in the air, clear, calm, and absolute. For a few seconds, no one moved. The courtroom was frozen in disbelief. Detective Mark Stevens stood still, his confident posture collapsing inch by inch. His smirk had vanished, replaced by confusion and fear. His hands, which had always felt powerful, resting on a badge, now trembled slightly. The silence was so deep that even the faint hum of the ceiling lights seemed to fade. Then slowly the bailiff stepped forward. The click of his shoes against the marble floor echoed through the room, each step heavier than the last. All eyes followed him. The journalists sitting at the back exchanged quick glances, their pens poised but motionless. Everyone knew they were witnessing something rare, a man of authority being held accountable right before their eyes. "Detective Stevens," the judge said evenly, "you are under arrest for contempt of court. Your repeated disrespect and arrogance have no place in this room. This courtroom represents justice, not ego." Mark blinked rapidly, his pride fighting against the reality he was facing. "Your Honor, with respect," and he began, but his voice cracked. The judge interrupted gently but firmly. "Respect is not a word to be spoken, detective. It's an action, and today you have failed to show it." The bailiff reached him now. Mark instinctively took a step back, disbelief spreading across his face. "You can't be serious," he muttered under his breath. "I'm an officer of the law." Judge Bryant's calm gaze never wavered. "Then you should understand the law better than anyone," he replied quietly. And you should also understand that no one, not even an officer, is above it. The words landed like thunder. The bailiff gently took hold of Mark's arm. The metallic sound of handcuffs closing around his wrists filled the courtroom like the toll of a bell. Final, cold, and echoing. Gasps erupted from the audience. Some people stood up trying to see better. Others simply stared in stunned silence. The clerk froze, her pen suspended in the air. Even the prosecutor, who had seen countless dramatic moments in court, looked astonished. Mark's eyes darted around, searching for support. He looked toward the officers at the back, but none of them met his gaze. They sat frozen, too afraid or too shocked to react. For the first time in his career, Mark Stevens felt small, smaller than the badge on his chest, smaller than the authority he once believed he owned. He turned toward the judge again, his voice trembling. "Your Honor, I didn't mean—" The judge raised a hand, gently silencing him. "Enough, detective. You had every chance to correct your behavior. This courtroom gave you patience. You mistook patience for weakness. That was your mistake." There was no anger in his tone, no satisfaction, only truth. That calm truth cut deeper than any shout ever could. As Mark was led away, the quiet murmurs began. The crowd whispered in disbelief, not because a man was arrested, but because justice had stood tall, steady, and fearless. Judge Bryant remained seated, his hands folded, his eyes following the officer with quiet sadness rather than triumph. Once Mark had been escorted out, the judge addressed the room. His voice carried the same calm authority it always did, but now there was a deep weight to his words. "Let this be a reminder," he said, "that justice does not bow to uniforms, titles, or pride. The law is a mirror. It reflects who we truly are when no one else dares to correct us." The audience listened in silence. Every word seemed to settle into their hearts. This wasn't just another court session. It was a moment of awakening, a reminder that dignity and respect are not optional even for those in power. Outside, as Detective Mark was escorted to the waiting vehicle, cameras flashed. The proud detective who once laughed at authority was now the subject of every headline. His eyes were downcast and his shoulders were heavy with regret. Inside, Judge Bryant removed his glasses, took a quiet breath, and looked around the courtroom. He didn't appear angry or pleased. He simply looked thoughtful, as though he wished the lesson hadn't needed to be taught in such a way. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. "Court is adjourned," he said softly. The echo of that gavel lingered in everyone's minds long after they left the room. It wasn't just the sound of a case closing. It was the sound of pride being broken, of justice reclaiming its voice, and of silence teaching a louder lesson than words ever could. And from that day on, people who had witnessed it would never forget the moment when a courtroom full of noise and arrogance fell completely silent, because one calm man chose to let justice speak. The courtroom was empty now, but the weight of what had happened still floated in the air like an invisible echo. The benches stood silent, the faint smell of paper and polished wood lingered, and the judge's final words, "Respect is earned by humility," still whispered in the minds of everyone who had been there. Outside, news cameras flashed wildly as Detective Mark Stevens, once seen as untouchable, was escorted out in handcuffs. The proud detective who had strutted into the courtroom that morning now looked smaller, his head bowed, his steps uncertain. The city buzzed with the story within hours. Reporters crowded outside the courthouse, repeating every detail. "Detective arrested by judge during hearing," the headlines screamed. Some people were shocked, others quietly applauded. For many, it was more than a courtroom scandal. It was a symbol, a reminder that no one stood above the law. At the police station, Mark sat quietly in a holding room. His badge had been taken from him temporarily, resting on a steel table like a symbol of what he had lost, not his job, but his dignity. He stared at it, remembering the countless times that badge had made him feel powerful. Now it only reminded him of how quickly arrogance can turn to shame. For the first time in years, Mark wasn't surrounded by admiration or respect. He was alone, completely and painfully alone. The echo of his own words from earlier in court haunted him. Maybe the court should review things more carefully. Tone is part of justice now. He winced as he replayed them in his head. They sounded childish now, foolish even. Meanwhile, Judge Harold Bryant remained in his chambers, seated quietly behind his desk. The courtroom had long emptied, but he hadn't left yet. His expression wasn't one of pride or victory. He didn't enjoy embarrassing anyone, not even a man as arrogant as Detective Stevens. To him, justice wasn't about humiliation. It was about correction. He stared out the window for a long time, the afternoon sunlight glinting off his glasses. Sometimes, he murmured softly, a lesson must hurt before it heals. That evening, as the city lights began to glow, Mark was released on bond. He walked out quietly, avoiding the reporters waiting by the doors. The world outside seemed different now, colder, quieter. The same streets where people once nodded to him in respect now felt empty. He drove home in silence, the hum of the car engine the only sound in the night. When he reached home, he didn't turn on the lights. He sat down, the darkness wrapping around him like a mirror of his thoughts. His pride, once unbreakable, now felt hollow. He began to think about his career, about the people he had brushed aside, the judges he had mocked, the suspects he had spoken down to. Slowly, painfully, he began to realize that his strength as a detective hadn't come from power, but from respect, the very thing he had thrown away so carelessly. In the days that followed, the story spread across the country. Some criticized the judge, claiming he had gone too far, but most people praised him for his calm courage, for showing that even in a world full of ego and inequality, justice could still stand tall. Schools, law professors, and ethics programs discussed the incident as a lesson in professionalism and respect. Mark avoided the spotlight. He kept to himself, missing work, reflecting in silence. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He would never step into another courtroom with arrogance again. The experience had broken something inside him, but it had also planted something new: humility. A week later, Mark requested a private meeting with Judge Bryant. The courtroom was empty when he walked in, dressed in plain clothes, no badge, no title, no pride. The judge looked up as he entered, surprised but calm. "Your Honor," Mark said softly, his voice steady but sincere, "I came to apologize." Judge Bryant studied him quietly for a long moment before nodding. "You don't owe me an apology, Detective," he said gently. "You owe it to yourself. Respect isn't weakness, it's strength without noise." Mark nodded slowly, his eyes wet with shame and understanding. "You're right," he whispered. "I forgot that." The judge smiled faintly, and not in triumph but in grace. "Then perhaps you've already learned what the court tried to teach you." When Mark left the courthouse that day, the air felt lighter. He knew rebuilding his name would take time, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel above anyone. He felt human. He had learned that true authority doesn't come from badges, ranks, or raised voices. It comes from how you treat others, especially when you think you have power over them. And from that day forward, whenever he entered a courtroom, he stood a little straighter, not out of pride, but out of respect. Weeks had passed since that unforgettable day in the courtroom, but the echoes of what had happened still lingered everywhere. In the police department halls, in newspaper headlines, and in quiet conversations over coffee. What was once just another court hearing had turned into a story that spread across the nation. Detective arrested by judge after showing disrespect. It became more than just news. It became a lesson. Detective Mark Stevens was no longer the same man who had walked into that courtroom full of pride and arrogance. The moment the handcuffs closed around his wrists, something inside him had changed forever. His confidence had been shattered, but in its place something far more important had started to grow. Awareness. For the first time, he began to see the difference between authority and respect, between commanding fear and earning honor. In the following days, Mark kept to himself. His colleagues treated him differently, not with mockery but with silence. They didn't know what to say. Some pitied him, others admired him for facing the consequences so publicly. But Mark didn't want pity or praise. He wanted redemption. He started showing up at work quietly, doing his job with a humility that surprised everyone. Gone was the detective who barked orders and rolled his eyes at others. Now he listened more than he spoke. He treated younger officers with patience and clerks with kindness. Slowly, people began to notice that this was not the same man they once feared. Something in him had softened, and that change earned him a different kind of respect, one that no badge could ever bring. Meanwhile, Judge Harold Bryant continued his work as always, calm, steady, and fair. He never once mentioned the incident again, though it had made him a symbol of integrity in the public eye. Reporters called him the silent judge, a man who restored dignity without raising his voice. When asked about the case in an interview, he simply said, "Justice isn't about punishment. It's about correction. The law teaches if we're willing to listen." Those words spread far and wide. Law schools began discussing the case as an example of ethical justice and emotional intelligence in leadership. But for Judge Bryant, it was never about fame or headlines. For him, it was about preserving something sacred, respect for the law, and for one another. One afternoon, several months later, Mark attended a public ceremony where Judge Bryant was being honored for his years of service. He stood quietly at the back, blending into the crowd. When the judge was invited to speak, his voice carried the same calm strength that once silenced a courtroom. "True justice," he said, "isn't about who speaks the loudest. It's about who listens the hardest." The words struck deep. Mark felt a familiar heaviness in his chest, the same feeling he had when the judge ordered his arrest. But this time it wasn't humiliation he felt. It was gratitude. When the event ended, Mark approached the judge, waiting until the crowd had thinned. "Your Honor," he said softly, "I wanted to thank you for that day. I thought it was the worst moment of my life, but it turned out to be the most important." The judge looked at him, eyes kind but firm. "Then the lesson served its purpose," he said. "Respect, detective, isn't just for others. It's also for yourself." Mark nodded slowly, his voice steady. "I understand that now." They shook hands, not as judge and detective, not as offender and authority, but as two men who had faced pride and truth in their own ways. For a brief moment, silence filled the space between them again. But this time it was a peaceful silence, the kind that carries forgiveness and understanding. As Mark walked away from the courthouse, the evening sun dipped low behind the city skyline, bathing everything in gold. He looked up at the courthouse steps, the same steps where he once stood in handcuffs, and smiled faintly. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could live differently because of it. That day he realized something powerful. Justice doesn't just punish wrongs, it awakens the conscience. And sometimes the most painful humiliation becomes the first step toward becoming a better person. From then on, Detective Mark Stevens was no longer remembered for the day he embarrassed a judge. He was remembered for the day he learned humility, and for the courage it took to rebuild himself from it. And Judge Harold Bryant remained what he had always been, a quiet guardian of justice, a man who proved that true strength doesn't come from shouting or punishing, but from the ability to remain calm when others lose control. Their story became a legend in the city, a reminder whispered for years afterward. Respect has no color. Justice has no rank, and silence, when used with wisdom, can change everything.